Tomorrow is the first day of Holiday Club. Holiday Club this year, if you're not aware, is called Mission Rescue, and we're going to be looking at the story of the Exodus, about how God calls and then uses Moses to deliver the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. It's a story that is told in the first part of the book of Exodus. And in a few minutes' time, we're going to read Exodus chapter 1. But I thought it'd be quite good to ask this question. Well, how did the Israelites end up in Israel in Egypt in the first place? Thank you. I was just testing, just making sure you're more clued up than me. And so we're going to explore this question, and that will help us to set the scene for Mission Rescue. But to know how the people of Israel ended up in Egypt at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we need to go back into the book of Genesis. And I thought what we would do, by way of an activity, because your chairs are movable, I'm going to invite you to get into groups of probably about 6 or 7, maybe a couple of rows or maybe 3 rows. And I'm going to give you an envelope, and in that envelope there are 10 pictures from the book of Genesis. And what you need to do as a group is to put those pictures into order, as in which one comes first in the book of Genesis. So you're going to put them in chronological order of the story. Now, under each picture, I've actually said what the picture is about, just in case you can't work it out. So if you can get into maybe, I've got enough for 10 groups, but we probably haven't got enough people for 10 groups. You are allowed, if you want to, use a Bible. Okay, so you should have got an envelope with 10 pictures in. I'd like you to put those into chronological order. If you've got a blank piece of paper in there, don't worry. That's a bonus piece, just for you to take some notes on. Right, okay. If you can look back this way, we will run through the answers. And we will try to get through the whole of the book of Genesis in a few minutes' time. So, I think Bob's just turned me up. You could probably turn me down again now. Now that they're focused and paying attention again, Bob, thank you. Right, so, hopefully, you started with the story of creation, which is where Genesis kicks off, where God creates everything, including human beings, but within a few pages of the creation in which everything is good, we see that human beings choose not to put their trust in God, but to put their trust in themselves, and that they think that they know better than God, and therefore we have sin is introduced. And then within just a few lines of that, we've got Cain and Abel, so 2 of the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain kills Abel, and you can read all about that in the first few pages. And then the story progresses until we get to chapter 6 and verse 5, where God observes that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And the only exception to that was Noah, and so therefore God saves Noah and his immediate family from the flood. But then we move on, so everything restarts again after the flood. It gets off to a pretty bad start, and it's not long before we discover people are trying to use the latest technology to make themselves into God rather than have to worship God, and that has been a trait throughout the whole of human history and isn't a million miles away from where we are at the moment, where we try and use technology to replace God and to become like God. And so that's the first 11 chapters of Genesis out of the way. It all looks pretty bleak. And God's solution in Genesis 12 is to call Abraham. So to call one person, the head of one family. And God promises Abraham various things in chapter 12 and in chapter 15 and elsewhere. He promises him that he's going to have a family. His descendants are going to fill the whole of the earth. And he promises that they will have a land of their own. Abraham is tested in various ways, and more often than not, he fails the test. But then, kind of towards the end of his life, he finally passes one of the tests that God puts in his way. His son, Isaac, so you've got Abraham, Isaac. Isaac goes on to grow up and have two boys, Esau, the oldest, and then Jacob, born just a few minutes later. Jacob's name means deceiver. He cheats his brother out of his birthright and out of his blessing. Jacob goes on to have his name changed to Israel. And so Jacob is Israel. So God changes his name from Jacob to Israel, which is where you get the Israelites. So it's the family, all of Jacob's descendants are Israelites because he is also called Israel. He goes on to have 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. And that whole story isn't one that's appropriate for an all-age service. But Joseph is very much his father's favorite, and he really winds his brothers up to such an extent that they want to kill him. In the end, they don't do that, but they do sell him, throw him down a well, and then sell him into slavery. And so he goes off as a slave down to Egypt. But there, God uses Joseph, and through his dreams, and Joseph becomes the prime minister, the second most powerful person in Egypt, and is able to save not just Egypt, but the whole of the area from a devastating famine. And if you've never read the story of Genesis, and certainly the first 20 chapters of Exodus, I would encourage you to do so. It's predominantly story, so it's predominantly narrative, so it's fairly easy to read. So say at least until Exodus chapter 20. Then we start to get into some of the more tricky passages that are more lists and things like that. But certainly have a read of Genesis 1 through to Exodus 20. And then if you want to carry on, I'd encourage you to do that. And when it comes to stories of scandal and intrigue and backstabbing and lies and deception, the events of Israel's origins as told in the book of Genesis have far more of all of those things, scandal, deception, intrigue. They are far more than anything you might find at a Coldplay concert. And there is, as I say, there's much of this story that I would feel uncomfortable going into any detail with in an all-age service context. It really is 18-rated material. So just to briefly recap Genesis. So it starts off with Abraham and his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob. They are kind of some of the key players in this part of the story. If you know the story, you will know that as well as being married to Sarah, Abraham also has another child, Ishmael, through an Egyptian slave called Hagar. And the story very much paints Abraham and Sarah as the oppressors of this Egyptian slave. And so whatever is going to happen as this story unfolds, we need to remember that's where it all kicks off right back at the beginning. Jacob, who is the deceiver, thinks he is going to marry a lady called Rachel, but he finds the day after his wedding that he's been tricked, and he's actually married her sister Leah. And then I'm not going to go into any details about this particular part of the story, but through these four women, so Leah and her servant and Rachel and her servant, we end up so they've moved to the top. We end up with all of these individuals. So you've got 12 brothers and one sister in there. So you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, who are born to Leah. Then Dan and Naphtali get born to Bilhah. And then Gad and Asher get born to Zilpah. And then finally, then we go back to Issachar, Zebulun, and their sister Dinah, born to Leah. And then finally, Joseph and Benjamin are born to Rachel. They are very much their father's favorites, as we've already said. Joseph goes on to end up in Egypt, gets married to an Egyptian, and he has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And this family are the head of the people of Israel. So when you read in the Old Testament about the tribes of Israel, they're named after these brothers, except for Joseph, who doesn't get a tribe, but his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, are known as the half-tribes. So you've got 11 tribes: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, and Zebulun, Benjamin, and then the half-tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim make up the 12 tribes of Israel. But read the story, and you will see what an absolute mess and kind of sin-ridden saga this whole situation is. But out of this situation come the people of God. So Joseph ends up in Egypt. He becomes prime minister. And because there's a famine, his brothers and their father and their whole family end up coming down into Egypt because there's food in Egypt. And even though they sold Joseph into slavery, Joseph is reconciled with his brothers. His whole family come to live in Egypt. And that's where the story picks up in Exodus chapter 1. And so we're going to read that now. The words should appear on the screen behind me as I read through Exodus chapter 1. So these are the names of the sons of Israel. So remember, Israel and Jacob is the same person. The sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar and Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that a baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are more vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." And so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." And we're going to think a little bit more about that later on in our service. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. So back to Exodus chapter 1. Just a few thoughts and a few reflections, really mainly aimed at those of you that enjoy taking stuff away with you and going away and thinking about some stuff and digging into some stuff a bit deeper. Just a few pointers to start us off as we maybe take some of this stuff away and dig a bit deeper into the story of Exodus chapter 1. So we've looked at this question about how the people of Israel ended up in Egypt, but we've not really thought about the why. And I'm not going to do that now, but I think it's a question that's worthwhile asking. Well, why did they end up in Egypt? Was it always inevitable? But hopefully, as we did that very quick overview, missing out all the X-rated, 18-rated bits of the story, but you can go away and read those for yourself. Hopefully, even with that quick, child-friendly overview, there was enough there that would at least kind of flag up at a few points that these people were probably not living in the way that God wanted them to live, the way that they treated others, the way that they were thinking. So going right back, so long before God saw the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, God saw the suffering of an Egyptian slave at the hands of Abraham and Sarah. The story is full, as we've said, of deception and lies and envy and jealousy and seeking your own interests before the interests of anyone else. And so by the time we get to the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, we find the people of Israel in slavery, there is at least a sense that they are getting what they deserve. There is some aspect, some element of judgment at play here. But then on the other hand, we are encountering a God who has made numerous promises to Abraham and to his descendants. A God who is faithful, a God who is true to his word, and a God who will work out his plans and his purposes in spite of the best efforts of his people to derail those plans. If you look at Exodus chapter 1, you might be able to see that. If you look at Exodus chapter 1 alongside the creation story of Genesis chapter 1, you will see how the author of Exodus is painting this situation in Egypt as very much a sign of God's blessing on the people. God had promised in Genesis that the people would, the sign of his blessing would be that they would multiply, that they would be fruitful, that they would fill the land. And these are the very words that the author of Exodus uses to introduce us to their presence in Egypt. So very much God has been blessing the people. The blessing that was promised in Genesis chapter 1 has come about. And so in spite of the wickedness, in spite of the rebellion, in spite of the sin that we have seen, God has continued to bless this family. He's continued to bless this people. He's continued to be faithful to his promises. And it turns out that the more they are oppressed, the more they flourished. And this is certainly something that we see evidence of in today's world. Places where the church is being oppressed and where the church is being persecuted, we often see that it is flourishing and growing and fruitful. Some of the places where the church is growing quickest will be places like Iran at the moment. So God doing amazing things even though, or it may be even because of the oppression that the people are experiencing. And this is something that's come up in our particular home group in conversations that we've had about how personally we often grow most when we go through hard times and struggles, that those are the times when God actually is able to grow us the most. There's also, so again, just touching on a whole heap of things for you to take away and think about. There's also an encouragement and a warning to us here. And it's either an encouragement or a warning, depending on kind of which side of the line we find ourselves. And that is that no matter how hard you try, you cannot stop what God is doing. And so for some of us, that will be a warning, because maybe we're trying to resist, we're trying to stop what God is doing. Don't go that way. That never ends well. But it can also be an encouragement, because maybe we're going through a difficult time. Maybe we're going through that darkest valley. Maybe we're kind of wondering, well, what does God know what's going on? But there is this reminder that God's purposes and God's plans cannot be stopped. We only need to think of the cross. No matter how bad things might look, no matter how much it might look as if God has been defeated, do not lose hope, because God's plans and purposes cannot be stopped. And then skimming on through towards the end of Exodus chapter 1, we have this story of the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, the first two of 7 women who appear in Exodus chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, without whom Moses would have died. You remember a little while ago there was a pulpit swap. Adrian was here, I was in Hardwick, and the topic I was given to speak on at Hardwick on that particular Sunday was the 7 women who saved Moses in Exodus 1 to 4. Partly my own fault why I was given that. But that's what I talked about. There are 7 women in Exodus 1, 2, 3, and 4 without whom Moses would never have made it to the story that is in store for him. Just sticking to Exodus chapter 1 for now, though, these 2 midwives display what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus. They fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. And God blesses them as a consequence. The mistakes that we come across in the whole of Genesis, the mistakes that we come across in Exodus, the mistakes and the consequences that we read about are as a result of people fearing somebody or something else more than they fear God. So Adam and Eve, for example, they're afraid that God doesn't have their best interests at heart. And so they take things into their own hands. And as we read through the story, and as you read through the next part of Exodus, even when God calls Moses, Moses has got a whole heap of excuses because he's afraid of other people more than he is afraid of God. And yet we don't see that with these 2 midwives. They display what true discipleship looks like. They fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. They don't allow the fears of this world. They don't allow the fear of what people might think or what people might say or what people might do. They don't allow the fear of suffering or even the fear of their own deaths to be the driver of their actions. They might be, as we thought a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, that doesn't mean we won't be afraid, but what do we do with that fear? We don't allow the fear of other people or other things to drive and dictate our actions. We put our trust in God and do what he has asked us to do. So a very not bad, the whole of Genesis and a chapter of Exodus, and it's only an hour. It's pretty good going, I reckon, by my reckoning. And so there's plenty, hopefully, for those of you who want to take these things away and to reflect on them, there is plenty there just to get you started. At least might take you a week. And then next week, we're going to kind of come back and we're going to have a look at what happens over the next few chapters of Exodus as we look at that story that we're going to be exploring with the children this coming week. Let's pray, and then I'm going to hand back to Fiona.